done.
Can some of us ride with you?
Before Brittany Murphy died, people were already laughing at her. Not because of a scandal, not because of a crime, but because of how she looked. The photos were everywhere. Paparazzi shots zoomed in too close, headlines asking what went wrong, commentators picking apart her weight, her face, her energy. It didn't sound cruel on the surface. It sounded like concern. But it wasn't. It was judgment, repeated over and over again, until it became the only story people saw. Just a few years earlier, she had been one of the most recognizable young actresses in Hollywood. Bright, funny, unpredictable. The kind of presence that made scenes feel alive. But somewhere along the way, that image started to shift. Slowly, quietly, and very publicly. Her body changed. Her roles changed. The way people talked about her changed. And once that shift began, it didn't stop. By the late 2000s, something felt off. Interviews felt different. Appearances felt strained. The same media that once celebrated her now questioned her. Not her talent, but her appearance, her behavior, her worth. And the more she seemed to adjust, the harsher the reaction became.
So when she was found dead at just 32 years old in her Hollywood Hills home, it was called shocking, tragic, unexpected. But if you looked closely at everything that came before it, it didn't feel sudden. It felt like the final moment of something that had been building for years. This isn't just a story about how Brittany Murphy died. It's about what happened to her before that moment. What changed, who was watching, and why no one stopped it. Because sometimes the most important part of the story isn't the ending. It's everything that led up to it.
To the public, Brittany Murphy was never the typical Hollywood star. She didn't fit the mold that dominated the late 90s and early 2000s. She wasn't the polished, untouchable, perfect beauty. Instead, she was something else. Awkward in a charming way, expressive, unpredictable, and real. That authenticity is exactly what made her stand out when she broke through with Clueless. Her performance wasn't just memorable, it felt human. She wasn't playing a character people admired from a distance. She was someone audiences recognized. That image carried into her early career. Directors saw versatility. Viewers saw warmth. She could move between comedy, romance, and drama without losing that emotional accessibility. For a while, it worked. She became a familiar face, a rising talent, someone with momentum. But Hollywood has always had a different standard behind the scenes. Being relatable doesn't always translate into longevity. In an industry built on image, relatability can quietly become a limitation. Brittany Murphy wasn't seen as a fantasy. She wasn't the kind of star the system knew how to market long-term as a leading icon. And that difference, subtle at first, started to matter more over time.
Because while audiences saw someone genuine, the industry saw someone who didn't quite fit the ideal. Not striking enough, not polished enough, not consistent enough in image. And in Hollywood, those judgments don't stay internal. They slowly shape the opportunities you get, and the ones you don't. At first, nothing seemed wrong. From the outside, her career was still moving forward. But underneath that surface, expectations were already shifting. Quietly, gradually. And once that process begins in Hollywood, it rarely reverses. But that's only part of the story. The change didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, in ways that were easy to ignore at first. A different look at a premiere, a sharper style in photo shoots, a version of Brittany Murphy that felt just slightly adjusted. Her appearance became thinner, more controlled, more aligned with what Hollywood tended to reward. But with that shift came something else, attention that didn't feel supportive, just observant. Headlines started asking questions. What happened to her? Is she too thin? Is she okay? They weren't accusations, not directly, but they framed her as a problem to be analyzed. At the same time, the tone of interviews began to change. There were still smiles, still laughter, but something underneath felt tighter, more rehearsed, as if she was trying to stay ahead of a narrative that was already forming around her. The more she adapted her image, the more it seemed to invite scrutiny. And the scrutiny didn't ease up, it intensified. Photos were compared side by side. Earlier versions of her were held up as a contrast, as if the past version was more acceptable than the present one. Inside the industry, expectations weren't spoken loudly, but they were understood. Image mattered, consistency mattered, marketability mattered. And when those things became uncertain, so did your position. Brittany wasn't being openly rejected at this stage, but she was being reshaped, role by role, appearance by appearance, into something closer to what was expected. The problem was that target kept moving. And the more she tried to match it, the less stable her image became. To some, she looked transformed. To others, she looked like she was losing something. That contradiction made her harder to define. And in Hollywood, being hard to define can quietly become a liability. She was trying to become what the industry wanted, but somehow the closer she got, the more the reaction shifted. Not toward acceptance, but toward doubt. And that doubt was about to change everything. Then, the narrative around Brittany Murphy shifted, and it shifted fast. It wasn't just about how she looked anymore. It became about who she was behind the scenes. Reports began to surface, suggesting she was difficult to work with, unreliable, or struggling in ways that affected production. Some outlets hinted at substance-related issues, though nothing was ever fully confirmed. Still, in Hollywood, perception moves faster than proof. Once a label starts circulating, it sticks. And that label had consequences. Roles that once seemed within reach began to disappear. Projects moved forward without her. Opportunities quietly closed. There was no single public fallout, no one moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it was a series of smaller losses that added up over time. She didn't just lose roles, she lost control of how people talked about her. At the same time, her personal life began to draw attention. Her relationship with Simon Monjack developed quickly and remained largely out of the public eye. To some, it seemed protective, private in a way that shielded her from the outside noise. To others, it raised questions. He was often described as controlling by certain reports, though those claims were never definitively proven. What was clear was that Brittany became more withdrawn, appearing less frequently and speaking less openly. This combination, declining career momentum, shifting public image, and increasing isolation, created a new version of her in the public mind. She was no longer the rising star people remembered. She was becoming someone harder to place, harder to trust, harder to cast. And in an industry that depends on confidence, both in talent and in image, that uncertainty can be enough to push someone out. From that point on, Brittany Murphy wasn't just navigating Hollywood. She was trying to survive it. People said Brittany Murphy was falling apart, that she had changed too much, too fast, that something about her didn't feel stable anymore. But what if that version of the story was too simple? What if what looked like a breakdown was actually pressure building over time? By the mid-2000s, Hollywood's beauty standards weren't just influential, they were rigid, thin, controlled, flawless, and consistent. Deviating from that image didn't just affect how audiences reacted. It affected casting decisions, studio confidence, and long-term positioning. Brittany had started her career outside of that mold, but as expectations tightened, she was pushed closer toward it. And once she moved in that direction, the scrutiny followed. If she looked different, it was questioned. If she tried to match the standard, it was criticized. The cycle didn't offer a way out.
It only demanded constant adjustment. Over time, that kind of pressure doesn't just shape appearances, it shapes identity. Interviews became more guarded. Public appearances became less frequent. There was a sense that she was trying to manage not just her career, but the perception surrounding her.
At the same time, her world seemed to shrink. Fewer projects, fewer public interactions, more time spent away from the spotlight. Her relationship with Simon Monjack became a central part of her life, and according to some reports, she relied heavily on that private environment. Whether that space was supportive or limiting is still debated, but what's clear is that it distanced her further from the industry that once surrounded her. And as that distance grew, so did the gap between who she was and how she was being perceived. To the public, she looked like someone losing control. But from another angle, it looked like someone responding to constant, unrelenting pressure, trying to adapt, trying to hold on to relevance, trying to keep her place in a system that had already started to move on. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was something slower, quieter, something that built up, piece by piece, until it became impossible to separate the person from the pressure surrounding her.
By the late 2000s, something was clearly wrong. Not in a dramatic, headline-breaking way, but in the details. The way Brittany Murphy looked in public appearances. The way her energy seemed lower, more fragile. The way interviews felt shorter, more controlled, as if she was choosing every word carefully. It wasn't one moment that stood out. It was the pattern. The media noticed, but the tone didn't shift toward concern. If anything, it became sharper. Photos were analyzed more aggressively. Comparisons became harsher. Instead of asking what she might be going through, the coverage often focused on how different she appeared. The same cycle repeated. Attention without support, visibility without protection. At the same time, reports suggested she had been dealing with ongoing health issues. Various sources mentioned the use of multiple prescription medications, though details were never fully confirmed. What is known is that she had been unwell in the period leading up to her death. Fatigue, illness, and a demanding environment can create a dangerous combination, especially when there's pressure to keep functioning, to keep appearing, to keep holding everything together.
And yet, despite all of this, there was no clear intervention. No moment where the industry stepped in publicly. No visible effort to pause, to reassess, to protect. Whether that absence was due to privacy, misjudgment, or something else is unclear. But the effect was the same. The situation continued, uninterrupted. People saw the changes. They talked about them. They speculated. But noticing isn't the same as helping. And in Brittany's case, that distinction mattered. Because by the time the situation became impossible to ignore, it may have already gone too far.
On December 20th, 2009, Brittany Murphy was found unresponsive in her Hollywood Hills home. She was 32 years old. The official cause of death was later determined to be pneumonia, combined with severe anemia and the effects of multiple medications. There were no illegal drugs found, no signs of foul play. On paper, it was ruled a natural death. But for many, that explanation didn't fully settle the questions. Because when you looked at the details, the situation felt more complicated. A young woman, physically weakened, reportedly taking several prescription medications, living in an environment that some later described as potentially unhealthy. According to certain reports, there were concerns about mold in the home, though no definitive conclusion was ever reached linking it directly to her death. Other discussions focused on the possibility of over-medication, again, without confirmed evidence. And then, just 5 months later, something happened that made the situation even harder to ignore. Simon Monjack, her husband, was found dead in the same house. The reported cause? Strikingly similar. Pneumonia and anemia. No illegal drugs. No signs of forced entry. 2 people.
Same environment, similar outcomes.
It raised more questions than answers. Was it a coincidence? A shared health risk? Environmental factors that were never fully understood? Or simply a tragic overlap of circumstances? Different theories emerged, but none were definitively proven. Officially, the case remained as it was first concluded. But emotionally, it didn't feel resolved. Because when two lives end in nearly the same way, in the same place, within months of each other, it leaves a gap, a space where uncertainty lingers. And in that space, speculation grows. What actually happened inside that house may never be fully known. But the questions didn't start there. They started long before.
Maybe the biggest question isn't how Brittany Murphy died. Maybe it's what happened to her long before that moment, while everything was still visible, while the cameras were still there, while people were still watching. Because this wasn't just a story about a sudden tragedy. It was a story about a gradual shift. A person who started out authentic, expressive, and full of presence, slowly being reshaped by expectations she didn't create. A system that rewarded a certain image, then questioned her when she tried to match it. A cycle where change led to criticism, and criticism led to more change. Over time, that kind of pressure doesn't just affect a career. It affects how someone sees themselves. And when that internal shift meets external judgment, constant, public, and often unforgiving, the result isn't always visible right away. It builds, quietly, until it becomes part of the person's reality.
By the end, what people saw was someone who seemed different, someone harder to understand. But what they didn't see as clearly was everything that led there. The expectations, the scrutiny, the silence when it mattered most. And maybe that's the part that stays unresolved. Because Brittany Murphy's story isn't only about what happened inside one house in 2009. It's about what happened in plain sight, over years, without interruption. A process that didn't need a single dramatic moment to change everything. Just time, just pressure, just a system that kept moving forward. And by the time anyone stopped to ask what was really going on, it was already too late. If you want more stories like this, the ones that go beyond headlines and look at what really happens behind the scenes, consider subscribing.